call on Deputy Clare Daly on behalf of Independents for Change. Of 10 minutes, Deputy.
Thanks, Ceann Comhairle. Minister, I wasn't here in person, but I was watching you on the screen, and I was reminded when you remarked of nobody being present of the final report stage of the climate change bill here, when there was actually nobody here except you and me, and I think you had to be here, but in any case that's another thing. But I think it's regrettable that you did use your opening remarks to have a go at the new government arrangement, maybe try and grab a headline. But I have to say I had a little bit more sympathy for you, having listened to the spokesperson for Fianna Fáil, who tried to tell us that agriculture was not a problem in relation to climate change, when it is an absolutely established fact that livestock emissions are equivalent to all of the emissions in relation to all forms of transport. And it's this type of blinkered denial that will put our planet on a collision course unless we deal with the reality of the causes of the problem. Now, at the Paris Climate Conference last September, obviously Ireland signed up to a deal that committed us to peaking greenhouse gas emissions as soon as possible, to keeping global warming well below 2 degrees and to pursuing efforts to limit temperature increase to 1.5 degrees above the pre-industrial levels. Now, post-2020, we are going to have to massively rein in our emissions, and the plans aren't there to back that up. The intended nationally determined contributions, which were submitted by countries during the Paris negotiations, where they basically put the meat on the bones as to how this is going to be done, would not deliver the targets that were there. But even the targets themselves are inadequate to deal with the consequences that are there, and would actually only limit global temperature rise by 2.7 degrees Celsius, which would be catastrophic in terms of the implications for life as we know it, and would precisely affect primarily, not exclusively, but the poorest peoples across the world. It is, as Naomi Klein put it, it will mean hotter, colder, wetter, thirstier and angrier planet at the end of the day. Now, we spent the last climate change bill arguing that the targets put forward at Paris were completely inadequate, that we need to be in fact committed to an 80% reduction by 2050 to keep the planet from crossing the Rubicon. And in that sense, if I heard you saying that the Paris Agreement was your political highlight and greatest moment, it is somewhat of a regrettable one, because that in actual fact is a shameful document. And, you know, we've spoken many times here about the various contributors to climate change, but one of the ones that's maybe fallen out of the spotlight recently, and I make the points very much in the context of saying that agriculture is one of the key offenders, but one of the ones that's come in under the radar is the whole area of aviation, which is the most carbon-intensive mode of transport. It has been incredibly quiet in all of the international talks, and I'm wondering, is that possibly because the COP21 talks were funded and sponsored by Air France, by the airports across Paris, among others? And, you know, this is something that is going to have to be addressed. So I make the points as an airport worker, where I earn my livelihood, the airport and its carriers being the biggest employer in my constituency. I make the points as somebody who obviously accepts that Ireland is an island nation, and fully accept that air transport is going to be the key mode of international transport and access to markets for a country like Ireland. That's a fact, we can't ignore that. But we can't look at it in a one-sided way. Any discussion on aviation, on expansion in aviation, has to be seen in the context of achieving targets laid down in the Paris Agreement if we're to avoid catastrophic climate change. And if we're to do that, then all sectors have got to play their part in that, including aviation. And so let's look at some of the decisions recently in that regard, because we're saying one thing and we're doing very different things that are having an impact on our climate. Now, we had the recent fanfare as a result of the DAA's announcement that the second runway would be developed at Dublin Airport after many years waiting. We told, yippee, great stuff, thousands of jobs going to be delivered in the construction of that runway. Of course, similarly, if a much more economically or environmentally friendly option like, say, Metro North was to be delivered, it would similarly, of course, develop thousands of good, environmentally friendly construction jobs that I'm sure would pay just as well. We're told this is going to be absolutely brilliant. It's going to bring loads of tourists into Ireland and develop connectivity and so on. But, you know, a plethora of flights to Alicante and Malta isn't bringing tourists into Ireland. It isn't boosting the local economy in Ireland. In actual fact, you could argue that the only economy it's boosting is the economies in Malta and Alicante and all the rest of it as well. So when we're looking at aviation and decisions in that regard, they cannot be solely economic. We've got to do a cost-benefit analysis that takes in the environmental considerations as well. And in that context, the last government's decision, which was highlighted very clearly by Andrew Murphy of the Brussels-based Transport and Environment Lobby Group, made the point about a number of decisions that we made. Like the outgoing government, which you were part of, Minister, last August announced £42.5 million to prop up loss-making airports across Ireland, taking money from the capital expenditure budget in some instances in order to put it into these areas. Airports in Kerry, Donegal, Waterford and of course the Taoiseach's own Knock constituency. Now, it is a fact that Ireland's internal connectivity has improved massively. So it's much easier for people, no matter where they live in Ireland, to get to Dublin, Belfast, Shannon or Cork Airport. There really is no need to boost these loss-making local airports that are going out to a lot of these destinations. Now, there are clearly some parts of the country that would benefit. The Dublin-Donegal route, Kerry, Dublin, there is distance to be travelled, but it is far more efficient to put money in there under the Public Service Obligation Scheme, which subsidises specific routes rather than backing up loss-making airports. And then we look at the big one, of course, the second runway at Dublin Airport. Dublin Airport is close to capacity, but not quite. Let's look at that. And we have to look at all the incentives that aviation gets. Aviation is exempt from fuel tax. It's exempt from VAT. There isn't a level playing field in that regard, and we do need to look at these areas. We know that climate change campaigners were gutted when this industry was excluded from the COP talks, and some of the foremost environmental campaigners would say in relation to aviation that ultimately an uncomfortable and familiar conclusion for aviation remains. A moratorium on airport expansion, at least in the wealthy nations, is one of the few options available to dampen growth rates within a time frame benefiting the 2°C target. And that's from Alice Bowes-Larkin in the Journal on Climate Policy. We've got to look at Dublin Airport in that basis. Planning permission for this was given in 2007, nearly 10 years ago. Our knowledge of climate change and our knowledge of the environmental impact of such has massively improved on that, and it would be completely negligent if we were to allow that development take place without evaluating it in modern standards and on the basis of modern criteria. And when we look at it, we see, actually, do you know what? The airport isn't beyond capacity. The problem is those morning slots between 6 and 9, where all the airline carriers want to use that slot, not necessarily to benefit passengers. Some of it is for the business clientele going to Heathrow. That makes sense. But somebody going on their holidays to Malta doesn't want to get out of bed at 5 o'clock in the morning to go and sit around all day waiting to check in their hotel. Those decisions and that capacity at that time is to suit the airlines to get their aircraft back so that they can send it out again on a return leg and get then again. And already the DAA are saying that the restriction restriction put in by On Board Pleanála for very good reasons of limiting the night flights between 11 and 7 a.m, that they intend to build a runway and then come afterwards and say, sure lads, we can't live with that restriction, and blackmail the local communities there, when we know that noise pollution is incredibly damaging. It's not just a minor irritant. Long-term exposure to noise is linked to increased high blood pressure, heart disease, heart attacks, stroke, dementia and so on, and has inhibited the learning of children based on analysis of noise of schools that are located near runways. So all of these things have an impact on human health, on broader environmental considerations. So I think when we have these debates, we should get down to brass tacks. Forget about the lofty sort of statements. They are important, but you need to evaluate government decisions against those lofty aspirations. And when you do, you'll see you failed miserably in terms of climate change.